Hey everybody, and welcome back to Uru. For this video, we're going to do a bit of uh, not really a side quest, but a bit of reading. And this is going to take a long time because there's a dozen books to read here. And these books or most of them anyway, are about the kings of Dunny. And while there's only 8 of them here about the kings. We'll be reading a lot more later on. But a few of them are here for the first king, along with a few others. And this is not really necessary to complete the game. It's just some background information. So if you want to skip this video, I'm going to be uploading part 10 in a couple hours after this one. So you won't have to worry about missing out on much. So this is going to take like an hour to read, so I'm going to go ahead and begin. I already have a list of the kings and in what order to read them in and where they are located, because they're not all in order on this rooftop. So let's start with this one here. This is about the first king, King Reneref. Reneref was born in 207 BE before Earth on Gotuwe. He was accepted into the Guild of Riders at the age of 5, a standard age, and as the years passed, quickly became one of the finest riders that the runway had ever seen. Certain records go as far as stating that Reneref was unsurpassed in skill by any other rider of the day. By the time he was 90, Reneref had achieved the rank of Guildmaster and was well on his way to become the Grandmaster. However, due to personal convictions, he had never achieved that rank. Before I continue, you should be aware of the fact that the people in Dunny live to be several hundred years old. So 90 for them is pretty young still. Just a little side note. Reneref had long been a challenger of the views of the Guild of Riders, as well as the king himself. Reneref was apparently very concerned with the society's views pertaining to the purpose of writing and the challenge of acting responsibly with the great gift given to us by Yavo. Around 73 BE, Reneref was asked by the Grandmaster to write a descriptive book to a questionable age, at least in the eyes of Reneref. He perceived the age being used to house an uncivilized race that could be used for the purposes of the Rone. Thus, Reneref refused to carry out the command from his Grand Master, and after much debating, was apparently dismissed from the Guild of Riders. Some records do point to that Reneref willfully excused himself from the Guild, although regardless of how he left, much of the society found the dismissal unfair, and some even went so far as to call it detrimental to society. Around 59 BE, the fact that Gotene would not be able to serve the Rone as a home for much longer was confirmed and the information made public. Reneref had long known of the state of Gotene, and from the time of his dismissal had apparently been working on an age that he felt would be a good place to live for those who wished to follow him. Excuse me. I'm just going to turn on my notifications so we're not interrupted by that again. According to various journals, Reneref managed to attract a few thousand Rene and convince them to follow him in the ways that he felt important and to the age that he had written. The king allowed Reneref to split away from the Rene, along with a few other smaller groups, while the majority of Rene left Gotene to a new home world called Terrani. Reneref took his group to Earth, where he established the Dunny, meaning new beginning. Reneref was a strong leader, immediately establishing himself as king and reigning for 120 years until his death. Obviously, those who followed Reneref to Dunny already respected him enough to separate themselves from their family and friends and thus records point to very few debates or disagreements within the society under the reign of Renerif. As had always been the case with the Rene, a group of surveyors was sent to Dunny before the group officially moved there to establish the Great Zero and the line emanating from it. A monument was built on the Great Zero in the year 0 DE. Unlike previous occasions, Renerif established the line of the Great Zero as set apart for holy buildings. Without authorization by the reigning king, construction was forbidden. Though it's never stated directly, records strongly imply that it was Renerif who chose where the city would be established. He seemed to base his decision on two factors which probably made the decision an easy one. First was the line of the Great Zero. It seemed to an obvious spot to base the city, with the most important religious structures being directly on the line and the rest of the city surrounding its center. The second factor was a group of waterfalls that flowed from the ceiling of the cavern to an area adjacent to the line of the Great Zero. The fresh flowing water was perfect for drinking. Speaking of water, a new writers' guild with fairly different rules than the one that had existed on Courtenay was constructed almost immediately 8 DE under the direction of Renerif by the year 100 DE. I guess that means during Earth. Renerif had directed the recreation of the 18 major guilds. The guilds were dedicated to Yavo on the Day of the Circle, a celebration not only of the completion of the major guilds, but a celebration of new guilds, which Renerif believed were healthier than those that existed in Courtenay. Guilds that have been established to please Yavo and not themselves, Renerif said. Certain records point to the guilds on Courtenay becoming extremely competitive with one another and focusing more upon having the best facility than carrying out their duty to Yavo and the people in an effort to curb that kind of competition. In an effort to curb that kind of competition, Renerif implemented a list of restrictions upon guild construction. The reconstructions included guidelines pertaining to placement facing the Great Zero, size, shape, and minor visual guidelines. Though one of Renerif's top priorities was construction of a temple, there were disagreements as to specifics, causing numerous delays in the finalization of construction plans. Eventually, construction was started in 48 DE, and the temple was completed in 63 DE. Known as the Regilt Overum, the temple to Yafo was meant as a place of worship as well as a reminder of the prophesied great king who would come to them soon. Renerif also made it a priority to install massive fans that would supply the cavern with fresh air. Natural openings existed, but it was quickly discovered that they did not supply ample circulation for the cavern. As a result, massive shafts and fans were built and installed over a 30-year period between 84 and 114 DE. It should be noted that numerous records point to a small group of Dunning disappearing upon completion of the fans, and is most often assumed that they remained on the surface of Earth to live. Throughout his reign, records point to multiple occasions on which Renerif refused to build a palace for himself. Instead, he lived in a fairly basic home, similar in fashion to most of his fellow citizens, and made it especially clear that until Yavo had a new home, he could not allow himself one. Although, even after the temple was completed, Minerva refused to build a palace, always focusing more on the religious and government sites. Minerva's own philosophy centered on the fact that it was much easier to focus on Yahweh and his wishes when circumstances were difficult and struggles more abundant. It was strongly believed that Minerva's refusal to build a palace was an expression of that philosophy. In 120 DE, Minerva died of apparent heart complications. He was 327 years old. Though he had married, he left no children, and as a result, he chose one of his apprentices, named Elish, to succeed him. Taken from the Memoirs of Elish, from the Oath of the New Guild of Writers, written by Minerva. Taken from the Journals of Grand Master Najan of the Guild of Legislators. Gautane's sun was dying and would eventually cause a rapid decrease in temperature, making it an uninhabitable age. The Great Zero itself was unusually based on a prominent natural landmark within an age. From the Great Zero, a line was drawn, usually toward magnetic north, to aid in navigation, construction, etc. It should be noted that the 18 major guilds of Dunny were not necessarily the same as the 18 that had existed on Gautane. In fact, they were probably much different, though there is no information that details the major guilds of Gautane. We do know that the guilds were meant to be flexible and serve the people in the needs of their time. Taken from a transcript of Minerva's speech on the first day of the circle. The prophetical work of the Regulator of Rooftop, a book Minerva believed strongly in, dealt with numerous prophecies of a great king who would be sent by Yahweh to guide the people. I think that's supposed to be prophecies, not size. Yeah. Anyway, that's about King Minerva, and the next book is right over here on this table, and it's this notebook. Okay, King Elish. Elish took the throne in coronation ceremonies in the year 120 DE at the age of 170. Though it seems Elish had never been a member of the Writers' Guild on Gautane, he had spent the first 50 years of his life with Minerva after his own dismissal, working on the Book of Dunny. When the Dunny Writers' Guild was formed in the year 8 DE, Minerva made sure Elish was placed in charge as the first Grand Master of the Guild. As Grand Master, he had worked closely with Minerva. In the writing of the new Guild of Writers Oath, Guild of Writers Oath, it can be hard to tell one sentence from the other sometimes here. The oath, which was what every member promised to live by, ended up staying in existence with few minor changes until 9400 DE. Records indicate that Elish modeled his life very closely to Minerva's. He refused to build himself a palace until a common library was opened, as he strongly supported a place where all citizens could have access to books. Though there were some minor disagreements on minor issues, the building was eventually finished in 233 DE. Although, like his mentor, Elish still refused to build himself a palace. The reign of Elish was extremely similar to that of Minerva. There was still great excitement for the new ideals and laws of Dunny, and thus great support for Elish, making his reign a very smooth one. Before his third son was born in 256 DE, records indicate that there was a bit of public apprehension over who the next king would be. Aelish's two eldest sons were fairly rebellious, and neither seemed good candidates for the throne, at least in the public's opinion. However, as Aelish's third son grew, it became apparent to the public, although records never give specific reasons, that the boy closely followed his father's ideals. Aelish must have agreed with public opinion, as it was his third son who he selected to succeed him. Aelish died of unnatural causes at the age of 350. Alright, that was fairly short. And the next king is Shomat, which is right here. King Shomat. Shomat took the throne in the year 300 DE, Dunni era. Okay, that makes sense. At the age of 44. Up to the point of his coronation, he had been a member of the Guild of Writers. He continued his study of the art through private mentors for a number of years after his coronation. It was the lack of proper guild instruction that most Dunni historians attribute the distorted views Shomat later took on. It was an up-and-down reign, partly due to a tremendous tension that seemed to exist between himself and his older brothers. Both of the brothers, though they had little respect, did everything in their power to make Shomat's reign tumultuous. One of the first actions Shomat ordered was construction of a palace. When it was completed in 347 DE, Shomat moved in with his family, although his brothers refused and maintained their own homes. Such an act was regarded as a tremendous disrespect to a family and only served to widen the gap between Shomat and his brothers. Furthering tensions, not only within Shomat's family, but within the culture as well, was the lavishness of the palace. Ornate gardens were present inside the physical grounds, and garden ages were written as well, linking from within the palace. Rumors abounded that some of these garden ages were even wiped of their inhabitants in order to provide Shomat with relaxation. Whether true or not, Shomat often spoke publicly of the need for ages to serve Dunni. This was a first for the society and a direct contradiction to what the guilds taught. The Dunni were to serve the ages. It seems that eventually the tension became too much. Some say it drove Shomat mad. In 387 DE, both his brothers disappeared and were never found again. It was commonly presumed that Shomat wrote a death book to which both of his brothers were linked into, although it could never be proven. Regardless, it was one of the first major challenges for the people of Dunni, and they reacted quickly. A prophetess was supplied to Shomat in 400 DE in an attempt to guide him in the ways of Yahweh. For the 155 remaining years of his reign, it seems that most people believed Shomat became a better king. The prophetess became an excellent mentor for Shomat and eventually convinced him to choose the son of one of his close friends as the heir to the throne. His own children were admittedly out of control. As it turns out, it was the bloodline of that child that led to the birth of the great king years later. Shomat died of natural causes at the age of 299. Women were generally seen as much better communicators with Yahweh than men. That's the wrong spelling of then here. As a result, most prophets were women. The choosing of prophetesses as guides for the kings started with Shomat and became tradition for all the remaining kings of Dunni. It was usually up to the king as to which prophet or prophetess he would seek for wisdom. Alright, that was King Shomat. We'll do that third journal here later. Next up we have the 14th king, which is King Nagin. Okay. Took the throne in 2356 DE at the age of 86. Nagin did much to encourage the growth of the major guild of fine artists, as well as the seeking of the other truths. The year 2500 DE, 1,000 years after the death of the great king, would mark the peak of what some would call the religious confusion. There were over 2,000 registered sects, and the original beliefs of Renerif were known by very few. Nagin was clearly not one of them. It is 2397 DE that most officially marks the start of the Dunny Renaissance. In that year, I can't read that word, is that Yamis Theatre Company hosted the first play written by the playwright Sira. The play dealt with the Pento War and the great king himself, and was one which Nagin praised. It ended up being sold out for 3 straight weeks, and marked not only the start of theater as a popular entertainment source within the culture, but also the beginning of the Pento War subject, which would go on to become one of the most dealt with topics of their history and their art. In 2408 DE, the 33-year-old musician Irin began selling out concert halls, marking the beginning of yet another career of one of the great Dunny artists. His music also dealt much with the great king, many times ridiculing him. Nagin praised his people for being able to express their true feelings in such wonderful displays of art. In 2488 DE, the first successful extrusion tests were carried out by the Guild of Miners, and to great applause from the public. Nagin used the occasion to benefit everyone. He appointed the Guild of Miners as a major guild, replacing the Guild of Fine Artists. He then split the Guild of Fine Artists into the minor guilds of sculptors, artists, actors, and musicians. The split was to encourage growth in mining as well as the arts, 2 major causes of Nagin throughout his reign. His proposal was strongly supported by Sira and Arim, as well as the other artists, who viewed it as an excellent opportunity for the growth of their respective fields. In 2500 DE, Nagin proposed the construction of a new council chamber for the guilds. Somewhat surprising was that he suggested it should be built over the tomb of the great king. The proposal was met with little opposition, and construction began 2 years later. In 2502 DE, the tomb of the great king was barely visible, a tremendous symbol of what Dunny had become. Later it was discovered that within the council chamber was a massive vault, protected by puzzles of a sort. The tomb had always been known for its patterns, some of which were claimed to have prophetic messages. Nagin apparently became enamored with the patterns and spread them throughout the unseen portions of the chamber, as well as the scene. Though the public knew very little of the vault at the time of construction, years later it was found to contain a tremendous amount of royal wealth, something Nagin often publicly encouraged. Of course, most were not able to save the amounts Nagin did, but still the idea of saving one's money for future generations was strongly encouraged by him. Nagin died in 2533 DE at the age of 263, leaving the throne to his 3rd son. In memorial to Nagin, Sira wrote another of the more popular of his plays, entitled Our Great King. It was the first play performed by the Minor Guild of Actors in 2535 DE. And notes here, taken from the Journal of Tevar in 3075. From a speech by Nagin, questioning the Minor Guild of Musicians. Though the official church registered a complaint, it seemed there was little heart behind it. Apparently, even a prophetess of Nagin supported the proposition. Alright. Okay, after Nagin we have the 25th king, which is back over here. Here we have King Demath, and he is the 25th king, like I said. Took the throne. Oh, before I actually start this, we will be reading the journals in between all these missing ones at a much later time, so you will not have to miss anything at all. Anyway, King Demath took the throne in 4692 DE at the age of 154. Though the public was generally not happy with the reign of G, it appears that as though they were pleased with his choice of Demath to succeed him. Demath had joined the Guild of Maintainers at the age of 5, as most did, and risen to the level of Guildmaster by the time he was chosen as king. The selection was a surprise to much of the public, and apparently even to Demath himself. It was not a post he had especially desired to have. Almost immediately, Demath ordered a ban on all unnecessary links to be enforced by the maintainers, while the council carried out emergency meetings trying to decide their stance on the outsiders. In these meetings, the council concluded that relations with the outsiders would continue, but with much stricter restrictions and guidelines. The list was long that Demath signed into law and included the restriction of any outsiders operating dunning machinery or linking books. Perhaps more importantly, the council and king sent a clear message to all of the factions who were against outsider involvement with dunning. Their ideas would not be tolerated if they led to any infraction of the rules previously established by Loshemnesh, which were to become strictly enforced. And though it was not stated publicly, the Reyama, meaning the unseen, was apparently ordered to double its membership and find any and all who were carrying out illegal activities with the outsiders. As well, Demath denounced the words of the Watcher as pure rubbish and nothing more than a desperately lonely man seeking attention. In 4721 DE, Demath pushed an amendment that forced the major guilds to accept a percentage of students who passed all entrance exams but could not afford the steep prices. It was the first such action in the history of Dunny, and one that many seemed to question, especially the guilds themselves. However, Demath was able to convince them it was a necessity for the society, and one to which they cautiously agreed. In 4724 DE, records point to over 10 separate groups being convicted of the Loshemnesh laws, as they had come to be called. Most agreed that the Reyama played a large role in the convictions, although there are no official records of their involvement. Regardless, each of the convicted was sentenced to solitary confinement on prison ages. The convictions must have carried a powerful impact on the society, as the public still knew very little of the Reyama, if anything at all, and thus had no idea how so many convictions were occurring. As one writer said, there were stories of dark shadows and mysterious creatures for those carrying out such activities. It was said that the eyes of Demoth saw everything, while his arms took anyone he wanted. The crime rate, especially pertaining to the Loshamanesh laws, steadily lowered until 4752, when there were only 3 recorded convictions. In 4784 DE, an assassination attempt was carried out against Demoth, resulting in the death of 2 members of the Worthima, who saved Demoth's life in the process. The perpetrators were found, and 2 years later Demoth ordered their execution. It was the first execution of its kind, and met with little resistance from the public or council. The 2 men were apparently linked into a death age, permanently ending their lives. Though most agreed with the execution, those who were against outsider involvement to begin with now felt even stronger in their case. Now they argued, Dunny is killing itself for the sake of the outsiders. In 4826, Demoth was rewarded for his efforts pertaining to the acceptance policies of the major guilds. The first of the Guild of Stonemasons, non-paying members, headed the effort to devise early fusion compounding technology, a building block for the eventual development of Nora. Demoth praised the Guild and the numerous opportunities that all citizens of Dunny now had to benefit their society. In 4843, at the age of 305, Demoth passed away, leaving the throne to his firstborn son. Some argued that G didn't make the choice of Demoth, but that Grandmaster Emas of the Guild of Maintainers made it. The matter was never officially settled, although most contribute the choice to G. From Demoth's speech explaining to the people the findings of the council meetings. By that time, the major guilds had become extremely expensive, and a large majority of the population, even if qualified to join the guilds, had no way to afford it. Taken from the private journals of Guildmaster Rishan of the Guild of Archivists. From Revealing the Unseen, written by Basharin in 5999. Goshen, leader of the cult group Blood of Yavel, made the comment in a public speech. The comments were made by Demoth at the public announcement of the fusion compounding technology. Alright, that's that book. And that's all for that table right there. Next up, we have the 28th king, named Megamen, which is this book right here. Oh good, it's a print, no longer handwritten. Okay, King Megamen took the throne in 5240 DE at the age of 83. One of the biggest announcements of Megamen's reign came rather quickly and was offered by the Guild of Miners and Stonemasons, who had worked together. In 5307 they revealed Nora, as it had been created in a laboratory weeks earlier. Nora offered tremendous opportunities for mining and construction, and ended up having a massive impact on future opportunities for Denny. Even at the time of its release, there was apparently much excitement about its potential. In 5312 DE, disease broke out in the industrial district of Dunny, most likely originating in the age of Yesefi. The outbreak caused widespread panic, as many predicted another plague similar to what had occurred during the 2100s. Fortunately, the illness was not nearly as lethal as the aforementioned, and the Guild of Healers reacted extraordinarily fast in finding a cure. Regardless, there was again a new push to at least separate the Nueril district far away from the city proper. Okay, Nueril. I guess that's how you say it, Newerville. Mayman apparently liked the idea quite a bit and encouraged the surveyors to begin looking into such an expansion. In 5359 DE, the Denny received another great reason to begin major expansion, and it came in the form of Stone Tooth. It was the second of the great diggers, and quite a bit more powerful and technologically advanced than the older Stone Eater. And Mayman immediately ordered the Guild of Miners to begin clearing an area along with Stone Eater for a new industrial district replacing Newerville. It was not until 5475 DE that actual construction was begun on the new industrial section Uran. Okay, that's 16 years later. Yikes. Less than 100 years after Stone Tooth, in 5473, the Guild of Maintainers announced that the newly discovered Delathini could be used to create much improved and much more protective maintainer suits. Though such an announcement may not seem especially important, the new suits ended up having a great impact on Dunning culture, since the maintainers were able to take bigger risks with the types of ages they could explore. The Guild of Writers were allowed to be a bit more liberal in their writing, and a new breed of age was begun. During Mayman's reign, words became a common topic of discussion, and attention was again given to the older temples. Evidence points to numerous remodels and renovations of many of the secular temples that had been built years earlier on the new line of the Great Zero. It seems that Mayman himself paid little attention to the religious pulse of his people, being much more interested in technological advancements and city expansion to care. Once Mayman felt that Stone Eater and Stone Tooth were no longer needed, he recommended using them to build an underground tunnel connecting the island to the city proper, and minimizing the need for boat travel. His proposition was not embraced by any means, especially by the upper classes who were living on the island. Apparently there were a number of protesters for fear of the effect the tunnel could have on the island. The proposal was also rejected by most of the guilds, causing Mayman to not force it. In 5500 DE, the first imports from other ages were linked to the new Uran district, much further from the city. Uran was said to be a tremendous improvement over the older Newerville, much more advanced, much safer, and there was tremendous celebration on the day of its opening. Security was tight in the new district, and it was, as was revealed later, that the Rilliamar had uncovered a variety of plots intended to display some of the factions' disagreement with the district. In 5540 DE, Mayman's only son became extremely ill and ended up passing away 6 months later. As a member of the Guild of Healers, Asham was often among the first to investigate new ages to make sure of their safety in relation to disease. As a result of his death, the age was not improved until a cure could be found. Mayman considered the actions of his son heroic and changed the name of the Uran district to Ashaman a year after his death. It was said that the death left Mayman deeply saddened, devoid of the excitement he had shown throughout his reign. Many said it forced him to the povertous Trisarti. Mayman apparently spent much with Trisari in his last days, and was able to die a content man because of her. Mayman died in 5549 DE at the very ripe age of 392, and chose his nephew? That's chose, 1-0, not 2, and chose his nephew, probably on recommendation of Trisari, to succeed him. a metallic gray stone 30 times the density of steel and the hardest of all dunny stones. Hang on. Who's that talking about here? Okay. Yesefi was mostly forest and provided Dunny with a good portion of its wood supply, including the expensive and rare Yima. The industrial district was formed during the reign of Nidra. Wait, who's Nidra? And served as an important importation center for most outside goods. The newer ages allowed for much more experimentation with atmospheres, animal life, and energy sources. From the Journal of Grandmaster Vishar of the Guild of Stone Miners. From the Journals of the Prophetess Tsarvi, assigned to King Miniman. I don't know. It should be noted that prophetesses had been assigned to all of the kings, but for the most part had become nothing more than figureheads, rarely consulted. From Asham, written by Ramina in 5589. Okay, I'm not sure of this, but Nidra might be the nephew of Mayamin. Okay, only two more of these journals about kings to go. Right. Next up we have King Asemlef. Okay, King Asemlef took the throne in 5999 DE at the age of 54. Asemlef inherited a people who were philosophically confused, the Watcher versus Gish versus the Great King Tevor, but technologically advancing many great construction, mining, and scientific inventions, expanding within the cavern at a great rate and moving toward diminishing the involvement of the outsiders within their culture. As well, the fighting that had scarred their past was at a minimum. Asemlef continued the peaceful trends by attempting to isolate no one, but instead welcoming everyone and any beliefs they might have had. It seems he took no stance on any of the varying religious ideologies being passed around and allowed any and all religious factions equal access to property, government help, etc. While disregarding no beliefs, he was able to hold his own, some of which were unknown to Dunny up to that point. Though never stated publicly by Asemlef, common opinion and historical records point toward numerous servants being used by Asemlef. Most brought from outside ages, most so were the apparent challenges Asemlef held with these servants. Details are hard to find, but it seems as though these challenges ranged from hunts by Asemlef himself to gladiator-style battles between the servants. It should be noted that, regardless of what actions occurred, there was little public outcry against them. Instead of philosophical or religious beliefs, Asemlef instead focused on mining expansion, construction of the new districts, and offering equal opportunities of culture and social benefits to all classes, as far as outside involvement. Asemlef publicly argued that the order from his father to all of the guilds was not realistic, and that outside involvement would always be needed to some extent. Knowing the comment would anger some of the factions, he became the first king to publicly invite the more extreme factions who wanted no outside involvement to his palace for numerous talks on the issues. Though no decisions were made in the meetings themselves were apparently calmed the factions and created a better overall feeling that the two could come to a decision in the future. Around the same time, two key writers from the Writers' Guild left to join the writers of Miavo. Up to that point, the group, who believed it was their duty to write the perfect age, had been relatively small. Like the writers of Yavo, most of the popular factions or cults of the day focused on Yavo in one way or another. The old cults, such as the tree and sacred stone, had vanished for the most part, leaving the way to disagreements in the beliefs of Yavo for the most part. Asenlev passed away in 6284 DE at the age of 339, leaving the throne to his third and youngest son. From the line of Kirath, written by Fowl in 6985. Worth mentioning, as the writers of Yavo would eventually become one of the three largest sects in all of Dunny. After the Judgment Age, most of Dunny believed one would either end up in the Perfect Age or Jakuth's Age. Obviously, most wanted to live in the Perfect Age, but there were, of course, a variety of beliefs on how that was accomplished. Alrighty. One more journal about the kings to go. Right here. And that is King Karath, the 34th king. Okay, so this one is not very long. Good. King Karath took the throne in 6731 DE at the age of 54. Karath is probably the most well-known name of all the kings, not because he was necessarily considered the best, but because he was the last. His name came to represent all of the kings in the later years, including the renaming of the Arch of the Kings to the Arch of Karath. His mother had raised him to follow the teachings of Gish, and by the time he took the throne, he was believed to be a wholehearted believer in the followers. Because of that, and the experience of watching his father interact with his advisors, Karath had decided from an early age that a king was no longer the correct way the Dunny should be led. At least, he argued, not until the true great king would come. The fact that Karath, in a single reign, was able to convince his people that the way they had been ruled for thousands of years was wrong and to be changed, should be considered nothing short of miraculous. Karath carefully crafted his arguments as a benefit for the guilds more than anything else. After all, he argued, Dunny is the guilds led us to be protected by their fortress and be ruled by their wisdom. It was hard for the guilds not to support a proposal that removed the king from the highest authority and replaced him with 5 lords that would be automatically chosen from the Grand Masters of the guilds. It gave all of the power of Dunny to the guilds, and there were only a few Grand Masters who seemed to disagree. Those few were known as faithful followers of the great king, and Nerif, who had always supported the role of kings. Fortunately for Karath, though his people believed a variety of different philosophical ideologies, only those who faithfully followed the original teachings of Nerif and the great king were disturbed at the thought of no king, and it was the majority of Dunny who no longer followed those beliefs, but instead those of Nemiya, Gish, the Watcher, and various others. As a result, it was a cultural impact that the public had to overcome, and not a religious one. Carath, attempting to further please the guilds, recommended new renovations and additions to the council chamber and construction of a new guild hall, meant to celebrate the new power that would be theirs. A symbol of the new power of the guilds and lords, and further insult to the great king, burying his memory even further under government construction. Construction began in 1670 on the new guild hall. There was no better symbol of the attitude of the Dunny in 1670. The tomb of the great king was further buried under massive buildings dedicated to government and the guilds. By the end of his reign, Carath had convinced a majority of Dunny of his own beliefs. Most claimed to be followers of Gish and his writings, and most viewed the outsiders as a threat. If not now, then soon, Carath often said. After his death, Carath's words would be proven true with the onset of the Medis War. Outside factions invaded with attempts to destroy the ink-making and book-making guilds, and almost succeeded. By the time the war would end, there would be few left who did not follow Gish, and thus believe in the end of most outsider involvement. The discovery that conservative factions had led to the start of the Medis War would come much later, when it was far too late to alter the conservative trends. Regardless, in 6977 D.E., Carath abdicated the throne and gave over the power of the kings to the first 5 lords of Dunny history. They were Lord Terry of the Guild of Messengers, Lord Himala of the Guild of Healers, Lord Moleth of the Guild of Caterers, Lord Kedri of the Guild of Writers, and Lord Corinnan of the Guild of Analysts. Carath died 8 years later. The time of the kings was over. Taken from Carath's public speech in which he first proposed the idea. From the first 5 written by Tarvis in 7000. I presume that's 7000 DE. Alright, well that's the last of the journal about the kings, at least for now. There will be much more later on. But we still have these 4 journals to read here. These journals are not about kings, but rather about various information about Dunny culture. We should begin with this one, marriage, or marriage. Yeah, that's a reference to Princess Bride, in case you didn't know. Anyway, much more than modern cultures, within Dunny culture, all citizens were expected to marry. In fact, it was even believed that marriage was an important part of a relationship with Yavo, as it taught and revealed the necessary requirements for such a relationship. Both marriage and relationships, and the relationship with Yavo, were described by the same Dunny word Tagon. Literally translated, the word means to love with the mind, and implied a deep understanding, respect, and most importantly, unselfish love for one another. Obviously, the religious influence on most of Dunny culture was very strong, and as a result, marriage was not something taken lightly. It was considered a lifetime commitment, and for a Dunny who could live to be 300 years old, it obviously was not a decision the Dunny felt should be rushed into, and it seems as though it rarely was. Some records point to rare arranged marriages, although for the most part it seems that the decision was up to individuals. Marriage was not permitted before the age of 25, and marriage between blood relatives was strictly forbidden. Though allowed, marriage between the classes was looked down upon. marriage to other worlders was practically unheard of. I found certain writings from the 9000s going so far as to call the mixing of Dunny blood with outside cultures a travesty, while others wrote such a child who marries an outsider was better off dead. The marriage ceremony itself was not a single-day event, but one that took over 5 days. Attendance to those sections of the ceremony to which one was invited was extremely important, and it was considered a disgrace to be invited and not attend. The event usually began with a small ceremony held on the evening before the first day of the marriage ceremony. The ceremony always took place at the home of the groom or his parents, and was meant to confirm both the bride and groom's decision to be united into one another in front of their immediate family. The groom presented his bride-to-be with a gift representing the confirmation of his choice. The acceptance of the gift by the bride-to-be was acknowledgment of her decision. Immediately after her acceptance of the gift, the bride-to-be was escorted away with her family and not to be seen by her groom until the joining ceremony that would take place on the 5th day. The first day was meant for the bride and groom to spend time with their families. As they were starting their own family, their old family would no longer be the highest priority. Thus, the day was set aside to spend time with that original family. Traditionally, the day ended with a large meal as well as speeches and blessings from the parents to the child. The second day was set aside for the bride and groom to spend with friends, both married and unmarried. Traditionally, one of the friends would host a large dinner at the end of the day. The third day was reserved for spending time with the soon-to-be in-laws. It was on the day that the bride and groom received blessings from their in-laws as well as other members of their family. Again, there was a traditional large meal at the end of the day, marked by speeches from the eventual in-laws and other soon-to-be family members. The fourth day was meant for the couple to spend time alone with Yavo individually. Though many apparently viewed that day as a formality, others viewed it as the most insignificant of all the days. The day was often filled with prayer, asking for Yavo's blessings upon the event as well as a time to understand Yavo's desires for their new lives together. It was also considered a time to purify themselves before Yavo. Some chose to spend time with the priests or prophets, while others read the holy books and talked to Yavo himself. The fifth day was the day of joining. The early portion of the day was set aside for physical preparation, while the later part of the day was set aside for the joining ceremony itself. For those who did not have access to private ages, the ceremony usually took place on marriage ages. For the upper classes, the ceremony took place in family ages. All family was expected to attend, as were fellow guild members. All those in attendance were divided into two sides. One side represented the groom, while the other represented the bride. Between those two sides, in the center, were a long aisle and a triangular podium. The bride and groom would each approach their side of the podium by walking through their respective family and friends. It was, after all, those family and friends who had made the bride and groom what they were, and the Denny believed it was those family and friends who should present the bride or groom to the spouse. The priestess usually stood on the third side of the podium. As with most important events, and especially marriage, the bride and groom wore the bracelets they had been given at birth as well as maturity. After the bride and groom arrived to the platform, the father of the bride would remove the bride's bracelets and give them to the groom. The Denny believed the giving of the bracelets represented the giving of the bride's purity and adulthood to the groom. A short speech often followed the event. The father of the groom would follow the father of the bride with the identical procedure, giving his son to the bride. The giving of the children was followed by an expression of both parents of their blessings upon those being joined, as well as all of those present. Symbolically, the bride and groom then switched sides to represent of an acceptance of all the bride's family and friends of the groom, and vice versa. Both the bride and the groom then handed all 4 bracelets to the priestess. While the priestess led the couple through their commitments to one another in Yavo, the bride and groom placed their hands upon the podium. During the commitments, the couple made promises to one another, followed by promises to Yavo. All were recited aloud to the priestess. The priestess usually reminded the couple that marriage was a reminder of Tagon, to know with the mind, and that their love should always be a representation of their love for Yavo. Following the commitments, the priest would place 2 new and larger bracelets upon the bride and groom. The groom's was placed upon the left wrist, and the bride on the right wrist. The new bracelets were meant to represent both the purity and maturity bracelets their spouse had previously worn. The Dunny emphasized that the spouse was now your responsibility to keep pure and knowledgeable of good and evil. The bracelets were meant to be a constant reminder of that responsibility, as well as commitment to maintain the best for that spouse. After the new bracelets were placed upon the wrists, the hands of the bride and groom were wrapped together with a tight cord, covering the wrists and hands completely. Upon completion, the priest placed the ring upon the pinky of each free hand. The rings were symbolic reminders of the entire ceremony and placed upon the 5th finger to represent the joining that took place on the 5th day. The priestess would then usually remove herself from the podium so that the couple could take her place. Together, the couple then walked down the aisle between the 2 parties and toward the far end of the aisle where a glass of wine waited for them. Before drinking, the couple knelt and prayed together to Yavo. After the prayer, they each drank from the cup, and the 2 sides of the hall merged into one group, often with great celebration. They were now considered joined, and the celebration could begin. Families usually fed all in attendance, and there was typically dancing and music. The couple was expected to keep their hands united throughout the night as a reminder that they were now joined both in the eyes of man and Yavo. The binding of the hands was apparently meant to be somewhat troublesome, symbolizing that there would be difficult times to the relationship, but that those times did not affect the fact they were now joined. Following the celebrations, tradition was for the couple to embrace and the priestess to touch a linking book to them so they would both link to vacation or honeymoon type ages. Though these vacations were usually short, it was not unusual for the man to not work for up to a year in order to build the new marriage. I should also note that the cord was used to join the couple's hands together was also viewed as a sacred item. It seems as though various couples used the cords in a variety of different ways, some using them for necklaces and others hanging them in their house. Alright, well, that was the marriage one. And next up is maturity. Hang on, let me go through this real quick. Okay, not very long. Maturity. Similar to a variety of other cultures, the Dunny celebrated a child's entrance into reason and maturity. The Dunny believed that true maturity, or the age of reason, as they called it, was achieved at the age of 25. Before that, the Dunny believed that children's minds and hearts were not properly formed. Up until that time, they even went so far as to say it was possible for a child to truly make a correct decision, as they were too easily controlled by other motives. That did not mean that what they did was not right or wrong, but that Denny believed that Yahweh did not hold them accountable for those decisions. Up to that point, it was apparently up to the parents to judge and protect and thus another reason society encouraged couples to only have one child at a time, under 25. In the ceremony of readiness, the Dunny celebrated a child's entrance into reason and maturity. At the ceremony, the child was presented with a bracelet of knowledge, also translated maturity. I have to admit the translation is somewhat poor and makes it sound like a magical of superstitious item. Something that it did not sound like to them. In fact, it was a fairly serious item. The Dunny viewed the bracelet as a sign of accountability. The individual once given the bracelet was expected to be responsible for his or her actions as he or she had truly knowledge of good and evil, and the wisdom to make the right choices between both. Associated with the bracelet were certain rights as well as expectations to behave in a more correct manner. From a religious standpoint, the ceremony of readiness signaled accountability to Yahweh as well as fellow Dunny citizens. No longer were parents judged for the actions of their children on a religious level, and no longer was lack of knowledge an excuse to Yahweh. The Maker, they believed, now expected much more from them. Though the age of reason was 25, the Dunny did not consider the true wisdom to come until much later. With not nearly the fanfare that the age of reason brought, at 125 years of age, there was another celebration for reaching the age of wisdom. Perhaps most importantly, regarding that status, the Dunny were allowed to become highest ranks of teachers or leaders, grandmasters or lords. The same rules applied to women, and no woman under the age of 125 was technically allowed to advise, especially the kings. As well, it appears that a woman's fertility ended around age 125. During the time of the kings, advisors were required for those kings who were under the age of 125, as the king himself had not achieved the age of wisdom. The great king, Alcindar, was the only king who did not have an official advisor, even though he was under the age of wisdom for the majority of his reign. Okay. That's the Book of Maturity. Before I continue, I want to take a quick note about this thing over here. Ooh, dirty cloth item. Interesting. Check this out. I know the DOC doesn't want us to touch these, but I bet Watson would like to know how these register with the doors, too. It makes no sense. And don't lose it. I could barely get it off the wall, and when I did, it was pretty scary. Maybe the weirdest thing is that when I went back later, the cloth I got this piece from was intact again. Nick. Interesting. There were other notes here, other than the books, but we will look at those after I read these two journals here. Okay, I had to pause my recording briefly to replenish my water and have a small dinner. Anyway, we're going to continue here with Pregnancy, written by Tricia. Pregnancy. Now this is surprising. I can't say for sure, but it seems fairly clear that Dunny women were only fertile for one Dunny day every 2 Dunny months. In service terms, that's roughly only 30 hours every 72 days. If true, it explains quite a few things. First, why there were so few children for people who lived 300 years, and secondly, the reason behind the rather large celebrations of pregnancy. As far as I can tell, these celebrations were usually limited to family members, although were rather large. There was quite a bit of prayer to Yahweh as well as blessings from the family members. These blessings usually included vows to care for the pregnant woman and child through the coming months. As I mentioned in other areas, pregnant women were believed to be much more insightful, and as a result, part of the pregnancy experience, although not part of the official ceremony, was using that insight to gain revelation from Yahweh. Though there was quite a bit of religious meditation expected of women during this time, I won't go into it here. However, this meditation was expected to primarily guide the woman to her child's future and its purpose, and was taken rather seriously. While pregnancy within marriage was cause for great celebration, the same cannot be said for pregnancy outside of marriage. As far as I can tell, any woman who became pregnant was expected to immediately marry, and any child conceived out of wedlock was unable to join a guild for its entire life. As well, no revelation was expected from such a mother. This was as equivalent a curse to a lower class woman, as her child would not be able to attend a guild of the upper class. As far as I can see, gestation was a full year, 10 dunning months, 290 dunning days, equivalent to 1 Earth year. I have found no records of multiple births. 290 dunning days? Interesting. Anyway, now we have class system by Trisha. Wait. Class is okay. And this is hang on. Okay, it's a fairly short journal, so we'll try to do this quickly here. Class structure. Seems as though my first inclination toward class structure was incorrect. Though early on there was little in the way of a class society, such a high ideal faded quickly. By 9400 DE, there were 7 very distinct classes. Elite, the lords and the grand masters of the major guilds. It was possible for private citizens to be accepted, but if so, abundant resources were needed. It was only the elite who owned private libraries of books and the private islands. Quite a few obvious attempts to reach out and unify the classes, although I'm not sure it did much good. Common libraries, major guild scholarships, renovation of poorer districts all seemed more political than life-changing. Not surprising, I suppose. Guild members, yes, it was possible for the lower classes to attend, but it seems by the end the schools were far too expensive and prestigious to allow for such. As a result, the graduates became a class among themselves, and a very high one at that. Upper class. The lowest of the 3 higher classes, such citizens had succeeded in private enterprise and most likely provide the elite with their banks, pubs, etc. No major guild education for the most part, but enough money to buy their way into the upper classes. Middle class, mostly shop owners and the like, able to afford some luxuries of dunny, but still considered far from the elite. Rare but possible for them to own books, as well as private agents, seem to make up most of the minor guild enrollment. High poor. The higher class of poor seemed to be made mostly of industrial workers, many of whom spent their time on foreign ages before it was outlawed, of course. It seems that this class, along with the lower 2, did not own books. Low poor. I can't seem to find a better name for them. However, it seems clear that there were 2 classes of poor. These low poor were relegated to their own districts and rarely seen even with the middle class, and never with the upper classes, possibly used as servants, although that was generally looked down upon. Sub-low, reference to the least, an undefined subclass, are found on rare occasions, not enough data to elucidate. Alrighty, that's all the journals. Whew. That was a very long read. But before I end the video, there's a couple of notes I want to read here. What the heck is my book? And why did someone take it in the first place? From a guy from Nick, apparently. This one. Matthew. The last batch of papers you sent were very interesting. Since you did such a good job, I've got another list I'd like you to divvy up to the team. How you do it is up to you. 1. I'd like some more information on family life, ceremonies, etc. Anything related to birth, marriage, cultural events. I know we have quite a bit of source material for this, so anything you get would be helpful. I think we've gathered quite a bit on science and technology, and not enough on the personal lives of these people. We have quite a bit of guild information, but gathering that all up into one tidy area would be nice. The fall is still an obvious area where we are lacking. I'm not sure I can help you with research material. That's number 3. With research material, but given the latest information we are getting at some time, we are going to have to dig into this. I recommend assigning someone the sole task of the fall. 4. Continuing on with the kings. A short synopsis of all the kings would be helpful following the form you started with the last batch. 5. We still have religious writings we need to translate. These are going to be the most difficult, but I think they can give us large amounts of helpful information. 6. We have a stack of journals from various study residences, etc., not to mention ages. I think that will be more than enough for now. Again, thank your team, and tell them you are doing great work. Dr. Watson. Alright, well, what is this thing here? Looks like a typewriter right there. And could have been used to type up some of those printed books we read. And by the way, before I began this video, I went ahead and went to Realtel and changed my hat back to its normal hat, although it's a different color. Anyway, I think that'll actually do it for these journals here. Let's see, nothing over here. We will be returning to this place a bit later on, but only briefly, and it will be for the second part of this game, the first expansion pack. That's a bit later on. So anyway, I think I'll end the video here. If you watched the entire video up to this point, thank you so much for watching. I know this is a bit different than the rest has been. But the next part will be uploaded later today as you watch this, so you won't have to wait very long. I haven't recorded it yet, but it will be recorded as soon as I'm done with this one. So until then, everyone, hit the like button if you haven't already, and I will see you all next time. So until then, have a great rest of your day, and take care.